much has been said about the legacy and impact of FW de Klerk. How do you think he should be remembered?
I think there cannot be any doubt that FW de Klerk wrote himself into the history of our country when he took the steps that he announced on February 2, 1990. Those steps opened the road towards a negotiated settlement. At the same time, one has to recognize that in many ways, FW de Klerk remained a prisoner of his own past. From time to time, he tried to break out, as he did from that past in February 1990. But at other times, he has continued to lapse into the grip of that past. And the latest evidence of that lapse into the grip of his past was his failure to recognize that apartheid was a crime against humanity.
What do you say to critics who argue that this was not a Damascus conversion, the moves that he made that you've just highlighted, but the apartheid regime had its backs against the wall, an international pariah state, the economy wasn't working, there really wasn't much choice for the decisions he made, and however tentatively some will even argue some of those decisions or those discussions had even been initiated by the recalcitrant P.W. Botha?
I would say that indeed there is validity in that argument. In fact, in my view, the attempt to break out from the grip of his past by making the announcements of February 2 was based on the fact that he was able to read the writing on the wall and recognize that apartheid's time was off. Forces within the country, as well as international forces, had lined up in such a way that there was no possibility that apartheid would survive longer. It was important that he should recognize that, while other colleagues in his ranks didn't. I think his predecessor, P.W. Botha, had been involved in a process in which he was seeking one way or the other either to emasculate the ANC and then engage with it. But he had initiated a process in response to Mandela's demands and contacts. He did, however, did not cross that Rubicon. FW's advantage is that, having read the writing on the wall, that apartheid's time was up and it would not survive, he then took the steps by carrying the rest of the National Party leadership with him into the process, but he entered that process on the basis that he would control it and dictate its terms. Those wishes were not realized because the forces for democracy were too powerful even at the negotiating table.
You tweeted yesterday, farewell FW de Klerk. Like Mikhail Gorbachev, he reformed the system he inherited in 1990, and if he had not relinquished power in 1994, it's likely South Africa would be where Syria or even Venezuela are today. Scenes. Are you surprised by how much so many South Africans remember FW de Klerk not as kindly as you do?
Yeah, I think he's obviously left a contested legacy, and perhaps it's appropriate given that the paradox, central paradox in his life and career was that he was the last apartheid president, but the first one to dismantle the system of which he was part until the age of 53. But what I really think is very important, just from where I sat, and I was right in the back of Parliament, that first speech that he made on the 2nd of February 1990, is to recognize the fact that perhaps just like Nixon, who was a very anti-communist president, was the man who opened the road to China and America reaching a rapprochement in 1972. And just like, as I mentioned in that tweet, Gorbachev was the prince of the Soviet Communist Party establishment who started to dismantle the Soviet Union. It was perhaps significant that de Klerk was a conservative nationalist until he had this great leap forward. For whatever reasons, he made it, and that's obviously a matter of conjecture and controversy, because I think no one else could have taken the conservative nationalist establishment with him other than someone really who came from the sort of background that de Klerk did. So very often I think to have change in a very hidebound society, which de Klerk led, as far as white South Africa was concerned up until that point, you do need to actually come from the very heart of the establishment in order to change it. And, I agree entirely with what Max said. He was the first National Party Prime Minister or President to read the writing on the wall and not assume it was addressed to someone else.
The difficulty, of course, with that is one could accept this sort of Damascene moment, if you will. But the difficulty is, if you look, for example, at what he said at the TRC about what he didn't know, the idea that these were a few rogue security operatives who were responsible for much of the mayhem and the hit squads that operated when he was in charge in late 1989, if you think of somebody like David Webster, for example, and others, but all the way to 1994. And I think that's where some of the difficulty around accepting his true conversion may lie.
Oh, I completely agree with you. I think that, once again, is the other half of the ledger, and it's not as distinguished as the first half of the ledger when he made the changes. And but, just because I think human beings have the great wish to be memorialized for the one thing, the big thing they got right, rather than the many things they got wrong, that will be in the full telling of the FW de Klerk story very much a very necessary part of it. But it doesn't exclude the other half of it, which is, in fact, that he was the person who held all the power, at least formally, in 1990, and then decided to set in train, whether he intended or not, a series of very dramatic moves, which meant he relinquished power 4 years later.
Let's talk about, you say that only somebody from sort of the inner core of Afrikanerdom could have done what he did. How much was he seen as somebody who betrayed the Afrikaner ideas and ideology by the moves he made within his own community?
Well, I think he was just to a significant degree, and that is why actually the other very significant and bold thing he did in 1992, his party, which had held unchallenged power, at least, and whites then had the formal political power, for 46 years was in danger of losing power because the Conservative Party, which was to the right of the National Party, was winning by-elections, and there was this famous by-election in Potchefstroom in 1992, which the CP won against de Klerk's candidate. And de Klerk then decided that actually what he'd done didn't have a mandate from his voters, and so he commenced with this referendum, and then he got 67% of the white people's support. And then, indeed, he could continue with the reform process that he'd started. But I think right to the end, there are a significant number of whites, particularly Afrikaans whites, who regarded him as a pariah or a sellout, or indeed someone who oversold a false prospectus to them, because he did make a lot of commitments to his own constituency between 1990 and 1994, which were not realized once indeed full-scale constitutional democracy arrived in this country. And maybe they could never have been, but maybe that was expediently the price that was needed to be paid in order to get us over that huge chasm which separated the two South Africas.
I reflected a little bit on what Madiba must have thought about FW de Klerk. I went through the Long Walk to Freedom a little bit late last night. And one of the things Madiba talks about in that book is the personal warmth and chemistry between the two of them, which you could argue really only came to the fore once both of them had formally resigned from active politics.
That's correct, Bongani, but it wasn't always that way. We would be wrong to assume that relationship was always amicable and cordial. Sometimes they had harsh arguments, which left me uncomfortable and embarrassed almost in a way for Mr. de Klerk, justifiable or not.
Tell me one example. Tell me one example, Zelda.
We had lunch once at their home in Stellenbosch, and they had an argument about it was always about the negotiations about the CODESA when it broke down, and there were certain things that Madiba held onto, where he felt that Mr. de Klerk could not be trusted at that point. But still, at the end of the day, I mean, we know what came out of Kudesa, and Madiba never shied away to give Mr. de Klerk the acknowledgement for relinquishing power. He always said that, we must remember that the power, the arms, the ammunition, the defense force was still with Mr. de Klerk at that stage, before the settlement. And to go to civil war was the only other option. And he gave him credit for realizing and stepping into the forefront to know that, South Africa can only move forward if there was the settlement, and for him to relinquish that personal power. So there was arguments about that on a lot of occasions, but nevertheless, Madiba always gave him that credit, and I think we must accept also that we are all fickle and fallible. We have this mixture of feelings about him, and there's still very many unanswered questions about the Craddock Four, for instance, about the Mashal family. I see how those people hurt after almost 40 years because they do not have the answers. And I think, as Tony and Uncle Max said before, it is a contested legacy. It is we are all full of contradictions, and the legacy of FW de Klerk will also be that, the two sides of this human being.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions.
Your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.